In Vanderbilt's rail yards, disaster was not a rare event, it was an expected part of the workday. Boilers swelled with silent pressure, switch leads vanished in clouds of steam, and loose freight cars drifted like silent weapons. Men stepped into danger because the system allowed no alternative. Records from the era read like casualty reports from a forgotten war. How could an industry so vital to America tolerate workplaces where catastrophe waited at every turn? Before we begin, if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to help preserve the forgotten history of the workers who built our world. Now let us step inside the rail yards that carried the Vanderbilt name, where danger waited in every direction. The Grand Central Yards in 1882 formed one of the busiest rail centres in the country, a place where movement never paused long enough for workers to feel safe. Tracks wound through tight corridors, and steam clouds drifted across the ground thick enough to erase entire locomotives from view. Switchmen worked in this confusion every day, stepping between cars, lining switches, and reading signals that could vanish in an instant. In such a setting, routine tasks often carried the same uncertainty as disaster. Newspapers that year reported several fatalities among the switch crews. These were not dramatic events. They unfolded in seconds, usually without warning. A man would step onto a track believing it was clear, only for a locomotive to emerge through the steam before he had time to react. Others were caught between cars that shifted unexpectedly when slack tightened. The environment offered no forgiveness. A single misjudgment, or even perfect judgment obscured by poor visibility, could decide a man's fate. The layout of the yards added to the danger. Lines converged and crossed in ways that left workers surrounded by moving equipment. Sound provided little guidance. The constant clatter of couplers, the hiss of escaping steam, and the echo of engines against masonry walls distorted direction. Many switchmen relied on the faint vibration under their feet to sense where a locomotive might be, but even that could mislead them when several trains moved at once. Inquests into the deaths reached the same conclusion repeatedly. The men had acted with reasonable care, yet the conditions overwhelmed them. No safety barriers separated workers from danger. No formal signalling system protected them from trains reversing through steam. The job demanded complete awareness, but the environment allowed only fragments of perception. The fatalities of 1882 revealed a harsh truth. In the Grand Central Yards, disaster was not an interruption to the work. It was built into the work itself. The Albany yards were crowded with freight the morning Thomas B. McManus began his shift in 1887. He worked as a brakeman on a line where link and pin coupling still governed every movement. These devices required men to step into the narrow space between rolling cars with nothing more than timing and nerve to protect them. The slightest misalignment could turn the job into a trap. In those moments, experience meant little compared to the momentum of the equipment. McManus had performed the task countless times. Crews described him as steady and attentive, the kind of worker who knew the yard's rhythms. On the day he died, he attempted to pull a stubborn coupling pin while two freight cars drifted together at low speed. The motion appeared harmless, but low speed in a rail yard was never safe. As he leaned in to free the pin, the slack in the line tightened faster than expected. The space closed before he had time to react. Witness accounts in local papers painted a grim picture. The force struck him with no warning, leaving nearby crewmen no chance to intervene. The design of the coupling gave him nothing to grasp and nowhere to move. Once the car shifted, the hazard became unavoidable. Yard workers understood that link and pin systems failed without hesitation, and those who handled them had little room for error. The inquest noted the dangerous nature of the task but offered no recommendation beyond acknowledging the risks. At the time, the system was still considered essential to operations. McManus's death became another entry in a growing list of coupling fatalities that plagued the yards. His loss echoed through the crews who continued the same work the next day, knowing the same danger waited for them. The Grand Central Yards in 1884 were dense with steam, noise, and constant motion. Engines moved through narrow corridors where visibility changed from clear to blind in a matter of steps. Workers depended on lantern signals to coordinate movements, but steam drifting from idling locomotives could swallow those lights instantly. In this environment, reversing a locomotive was among the most hazardous tasks. The backup collision that year revealed how easily routine operations could turn disastrous. The incident began when a yard engine started a reverse move along one of the switching leads. Such manoeuvres relied on a spotter walking ahead, yet even the most attentive crew could be overcome by the environment. Newspapers recorded that heavy steam lingered across the tracks that morning. Sound was distorted by brick walls and nearby engines, and the sharp clang of couplers masked approaching movement. Workers farther down the line were performing routine repairs, unaware that a locomotive was backing toward them. Witnesses later explained that the crew ahead did not see the engine until it emerged through the steam only moments before impact. The engineer had no reliable signals to guide him. The spotter's warnings were lost in the noise, and by the time the figures of the workers appeared, the stopping distance had already disappeared. The collision unfolded in seconds, leaving no time for anyone to scatter. The inquest acknowledged that no individual had acted carelessly. Instead, the yard itself created conditions that overwhelmed even experienced workers. Tracks twisted between buildings that blocked sightlines, and steam created pockets of near blindness. Reversing locomotives moved quietly compared to forward motions, reducing the warnings men depended on. The 1884 collision became a stark example of how Grand Central's environment turned simple movements into life-threatening events, showing that the greatest danger often came from machinery workers never saw approaching. Engine number 173 began its morning run in 1880 with nothing unusual to mark the start of the day. The locomotive had been heated, inspected in the limited ways the era allowed, and sent onto the Hudson Division with the expectation that it would perform like dozens of others. Yet boilers of that time carried hidden dangers. Internal corrosion, metal fatigue, and fluctuating water levels created conditions that could turn a routine assignment into a deadly blast. The crew working aboard number 173 faced these risks every time they stepped into the cab. The explosion occurred shortly after departure. Witnesses described a sudden roar, followed by a violent cloud of steam and debris. Boilers failed with enormous force, and when number 173 ruptured, the blast scattered iron fragments across the right-of-way. Workers nearby reported that the engine seemed to disintegrate in front of them. The crew had no chance to escape. Steam consumed the cab before anyone could react, and fragments of the boiler were hurled far beyond the rails. Investigations into the failure pointed to weaknesses that would have been invisible from the outside. Boiler plates thinned over time, and inspections relied largely on sight and sound. There were no modern pressure relief systems, and gauges often misread the true internal conditions. If water levels dipped too low, the overheated metal weakened rapidly. If pressure rose too high, the iron shell could no longer contain it. In the case of number 173, a combination of fatigue and internal corrosion likely pushed the boiler past its breaking point. The explosion reminded crews across the division that even a well-run locomotive could hide lethal flaws. It exposed the harsh truth that firemen and engineers worked inches away from machinery, capable of catastrophic failure, often with no warning at all. The West Albany yards in 1891 operated on a slope that appeared slight but carried real danger. Freight cars depended on handbrakes, wheel chocks, and the attention of crews to remain stationary. When even one component failed, gravity took control. That year, a line of cars broke free and began rolling down the grade with increasing speed. Workers nearby heard the rumble too late. The event began during a standard separation of cars for repair work. A brake chain loosened on one of the cars positioned on the incline. Once the chain slipped, the car moved slowly at first, then gained momentum as it pulled additional cars behind it. No one expected a runaway in that moment, and the drifting steam from shop locomotives masked the early signs of movement. By the time warnings were shouted, the cars were already accelerating. Newspaper accounts described the chaos that followed. Workers attempted to scramble clear, but the yard's tight layout left limited room to escape. Tracks were closely spaced, equipment littered the walkways, and visibility was compromised by the constant haze of smoke. The runaway cars struck a group of men before they could reach safety. The impact was severe, and several workers were killed instantly. The investigation focused on the brake system and the hazardous incline, but broader issues received little attention. Car brakes wore out quickly under heavy use, yet replacements were often delayed. The incline was known to create risks, but redesigning the yard was considered impractical. As a result, the conditions that caused the disaster persisted long after the event. The Runaway incident demonstrated how quickly control could be lost in a yard shaped by aging equipment and constant pressure. It showed that even experienced crews had little defence against forces set in motion by a single mechanical failure. Night work in the rail yards required a careful balance of instinct and limited visibility. Workers depended on lantern signals to guide movements, yet fog, steam and smoke often made those signals disappear. In 1887, a brakeman at a New York Central yard misread a lantern in heavy mist and stepped directly into the path of an oncoming engine. His death illustrated how fragile communication became under the conditions common to Gilded Age rail operations. The incident occurred during a night shift when several crews were moving cars between sidings. Steam from idling locomotives drifted across the tracks and mixed with cool air, creating dense pockets of fog. The brakeman attempted to cross a line he believed was clear. A lantern signal, seen only faintly, suggested the engine ahead was stationary. That interpretation proved fatal. The engine was already moving, and the steam cloud concealed both sound and motion. Witnesses explained that visibility shrank without warning. One moment the track appeared open, and the next it vanished behind a curtain of vapour. Lanterns were easily mistaken for lights positioned farther away, and their dim glow could be distorted by moisture in the air. The brakeman had seconds to make his decision, and the environment gave him a little information to rely on. The engineer saw the man only when it was too late to stop. Reversing the locomotive required time, and the yard's cramped layout offered no room for evasive action. The brakeman was struck before the crew could react. The inquest recognised the visibility hazards, but concluded that night work remained essential. No improved lighting systems existed, and lanterns remained the only option. The fatality underscored a harsh truth. Even skilled workers face life-threatening uncertainty when steam and darkness combined to erase the signals they depended upon. Roundhouses were vital to rail operations, yet their design made them among the most dangerous structures in any yard. Engines entered with hot fireboxes, oil-soaked floors surrounded every stall, and roof vents carried sparks that sometimes drifted back onto the building. In 1892, a fire swept through the West Albany Roundhouse so rapidly that workers struggled to escape. The event showed how easily these facilities could transform from repair centres into death traps. The fire began near one of the service pits where a locomotive was being prepared for inspection. Newspapers reported that an oil-soaked rag ignited, possibly from a stray ember. Flames spread across wooden walkways and crept toward the stored fuel supplies. Workers attempted to contain the fire with buckets, but the heat intensified too quickly. The curved structure of the roundhouse acted like a funnel, drawing flames upward and sending smoke into every adjoining stall. Engines inside the building made evacuation difficult. Some locomotives sat cold and could not be moved, blocking escape routes. Others were partially disassembled, leaving crews with no safe way to reposition them. The fire grew hotter as it reached additional fuel reserves. Dense smoke filled the interior, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Workers described stumbling toward the doors while disoriented by the thick fumes. Several men were trapped temporarily when collapsing beams blocked parts of the exit. Rescuers struggled to reach them through the heavy smoke. Although many eventually escaped, the speed and intensity of the fire left lasting fear among the crews. The structure was damaged extensively, and the recovery process revealed how quickly combustible materials allowed flames to travel. The Roundhouse fire demonstrated the inherent vulnerabilities in facilities built from wood and saturated with oil. It exposed the dangerous reality that workers inside had little protection once flames began to spread, leaving survival largely to chance. Maintenance crews often worked beneath trestles they believed were stable. In 1889, a small trestle at the Spuyten Duyvil yard collapsed, while a repair crew was still underneath, sending debris and rail ties onto the men below. The event illustrated how vulnerable older wooden structures had become after decades of constant strain. The trestle served a lightly used track, but even minimal traffic placed repeated pressure on its aging supports. Weathering weakened the beams, and moisture from the nearby river accelerated decay. Workers were assigned to replace key sections while the structure remained partially active. This arrangement was common in the era. Taking a trestle fully out of service was considered impractical because it disrupted yard operations. On the morning of the collapse, the crew was removing deteriorated timbers when the structure shifted unexpectedly. Witnesses said a low vibration travelled through the beams moments before failure. The weight of the remaining sections proved too much, and the trestle gave way. Heavy timbers and iron fittings fell into the work area with no time for the men below to escape. The investigation revealed that internal rot had gone deeper than expected. Inspections often relied on outward appearance, and damaged wood could appear sound on the surface while compromised inside. Load calculations of the time were rudimentary, and crews depended largely on experience to judge whether a structure could withstand repairs conducted beneath it. The collapse emphasized how unpredictable deteriorating infrastructure could be. Even skilled workers who followed standard procedures had little control over hidden structural failures. The trestle's sudden break showed that aged materials, constant vibration, and rushed maintenance practices combined to create life-threatening conditions. For the crews who continued working similar jobs, the incident became a reminder that the structures they repaired could fail at any moment, regardless of their apparent stability. In the final year before automatic couplers were required by law, a New York Central brakeman was killed while attempting to guide a link and pin into place between two freight cars. His death, reported in multiple newspapers in 1893, became one of the last reminders of how dangerous the old coupling system truly was. Thousands of workers had suffered similar injuries, yet widespread reform came only after decades of pressure. The brakeman attempted to align the coupler, while the cars drifted together at slow speed. Slow movement still carried immense danger. The man positioned himself between the cars, holding the pin in one hand while signalling the engineer with the other. The coupler jolted slightly out of alignment. The drift continued a moment longer than expected, and the narrow space closed before he could retreat. The impact was immediate, leaving him with no chance of survival. News accounts highlighted the tragedy as further proof that the link and pin system needed to be eliminated. The mechanism required men to place their bodies in situations where the slightest misjudgment, or even a routine jolt, could crush them instantly. Automatic couplers had already been invented, yet adoption lagged due to cost and logistical challenges. Many railroads waited until legislation forced the transition. The fatality underscored the difficult reality of the era. Workers bore the risks created by outdated equipment, and improvements often arrived only after enough deaths accumulated to demand change. The new law took effect soon after, finally requiring railroads to replace the hazardous couplings. The 1893 accident served as a closing chapter for one of the deadliest practices in railroad history, highlighting the gap between technological progress and the protections workers desperately needed. The New York Central's 1885 annual casualty ledger listed the year's injuries and deaths with the precision of an accountant's record. Each entry contained only brief details, a name, a location, and a cause. Yet behind every line was a story of a worker who had stepped into a yard shaped by danger. The ledger revealed the sheer scale of harm within Vanderbilt's empire, where hundreds of cases were recorded in a single year. The ledger included fatalities among switchmen, brakemen, firemen, shop workers, and maintenance crews. Many entries reference common causes, such as crushed limbs, coupling accidents, falls from moving cars, and collisions during switching. The repetition of phrases reflected a workplace where the same dangers resurfaced continually. Nothing in the document elaborated on the conditions surrounding each incident, but the patterns made the environment unmistakable. One entry noted the death of a worker during switching operations near a crowded yard lead. Another described injuries from a boiler-related event. Others referenced workers struck during low-visibility conditions or crushed between cars. These accounts lacked detail, yet the collective weight of the list told the true story. The ledger functioned less as a memorial than a tally of operational loss, reducing lives to figures within a corporate report. The document demonstrated how normalized the dangers had become. Rather than signaling a failure that demanded immediate action, the numbers were accepted as part of the cost of maintaining a vast rail system. Safety reforms progressed slowly, and many improvements came only after repeated tragedies made inaction impossible. To modern readers, the ledger stands as one of the clearest windows into the human cost of Gilded Age railroading. It captures a world where worker deaths were routine, expected, and quietly absorbed into the machinery of industry.